All right, this is History 366, Section 1. This will be the lecture for the section, and you will need to know it for the midterm. History 366 is the Progressive Era and the Gilded Age, but we're talking here about what comes right before the Gilded Age, which is Reconstruction. Reconstruction was a time period in the United States following the Civil War in which the United States, after the war, was trying to figure out what next. And that is what to do about the South, the Confederacy that had rebelled against the United States government and the freed slaves. There is a great tragedy here in that the man who was best suited to address both of those issues, Abraham Lincoln, is assassinated just 5 days after the fighting ends. Lincoln had wanted to rebuild the country peacefully. In his second inaugural address, he said, "With malice toward none, with charity for all." He wanted to bring the country together, not punish the South, but he also wanted to help the freed slaves. His successor, Andrew Johnson, believes in none of those things. If you're following along here in the PowerPoint, I'm on Andrew Johnson and Reconstruction. Andrew Johnson was a Democrat from Tennessee who was the only senator from the South. There were 11 Confederate states, so there were 22 senators. 21 out of 22 simply left the United States government. Andrew Johnson stayed in his Senate seat. Andrew Johnson was a Democrat, but he was pro-union and he opposed slavery. However, it's a very weird thing. He opposed slavery mostly because he hated the slave owners, not because he really liked the slaves, which he didn't. He was a racist even by the standards of the day. In 1864, Andrew Johnson was picked to be Abraham Lincoln's vice president. It's an odd situation since Johnson is a member of a different party, but Lincoln kind of wanted to unite the country and say, hey, I have a Southerner on the ticket. This will have terrible repercussion for the country because when Johnson takes over, his views on Reconstruction and what to do about the freed slaves differ very radically than Abraham Lincoln's. The war ended in 1865, and the South was defeated. There was no doubt of this. The 11 Confederate states were crushed militarily, and Lincoln, as I mentioned, wanted to try to bring the country back together peacefully. The problem was that once Andrew Johnson becomes president in April of 1865, he decides that once the slaves are freed, which there's an amendment ratified in December of 1865 that frees the slaves, the war is over. Nothing else needs to be done. Johnson does not believe in doing anything for the freed slaves, which sets up a battle between a group of people in Congress who are known as the Radical Republicans. The Radical Republicans are a group of Republicans from the North who actually believe in black equality. They believe it's the responsibility of the government to provide for equal protection for the freed slaves and see that blacks in the South have civil rights. Johnson, again, believes none of these things. Beginning in December of 1865, the Radical Republicans in the United States House and the United States Senate battle with Andrew Johnson over the fate of Reconstruction. Johnson, who is commander-in-chief of the military, simply refuses to do anything to protect the freed slaves, and by late 1865, many of the former slaves have gone back to working for their masters. It's a very strange situation. If you look at the slide, President versus Congress, Andrew Johnson argues Reconstruction is over and there's no need for any legislation concerning the slaves. The southern states are back in the Union, and significantly, the leaders of the Confederacy, the men who rebelled against the Union, are now back running the southern states, such as Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Texas, Georgia, South Carolina. They are harassing the freed slaves, not giving them any rights. And there are people in the North who are furious because the question is, why exactly did we fight a war if nothing really has changed, because white supremacy has returned to the South? Johnson is from Tennessee. As I mentioned, he hated slavery because he hated the slave owners, or he opposed slavery because he hated the slave owners, but he didn't support anything in regard to freedom or equality for the freed slaves. And Congress in 1866 passes the Civil Rights Act, which guarantees that under the law, African Americans have equal rights. Johnson vetoes it. What Congress does in response is Congress has the right to sit its own members. And the Republicans in the United States House and the United States Senate vote to expel members who were part of the Confederacy. So, for example, Alexander Stephens, who was vice president of the Confederacy, was a senator now from Georgia. He had been elected by the people of Georgia, the white people of Georgia, and sent back to Washington, D.C. in 1865. Well, the Senate votes to expel all of them. What this means is the Republicans dominate Congress, and they're able to pass laws over Andrew Johnson's veto. They pass a series of laws. If you're looking at the battles, the 1867 Military Reconstruction Act. This act takes the 11 Confederate states and say, you're no longer states. We're dividing you into 5 military districts. Essentially, they're going to have martial law there. The army is going to be sent in to protect the freed slaves. Now, as I mentioned, Johnson is commander-in-chief and he controls the army, but this act effectively strips Johnson of control. So you're setting a constitutional showdown here. The radical Republicans want to protect the rights of freed slaves. Andrew Johnson does not. Eventually, you get a showdown that leads to impeachment. Now, impeachment means essentially indictment. We're dealing with this right now. Andrew Johnson deliberately violates a law that Congress has passed. He fires someone. In response, the United States House of Representatives impeaches Andrew Johnson. Impeach him. What that means is he will then have a trial in the United States Senate, and this is in 1868. Remember, Johnson became president in April of 1865. He's now been battling with the House and Senate for 3 years. And in early 1868, he has a trial. He is not convicted. He survives by 1 vote. But effectively, this is kind of the end of any power he has. He will be president for 1 more year, although he has virtually no power. Congress has essentially stripped him of any power, and the United States Army really isn't taking orders from this. It's a very strange situation. What you get between 1867 to 1877 is a 10-year period in which there is an effort now for Reconstruction. You have a 13th Amendment ratified abolishing slavery, a 14th Amendment that guarantees equal protection under the law, a 15th Amendment guaranteeing black men the right to vote. And for 8 years, the president is Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant had been the great Union general who had defeated the South. Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant in April of 1865, and in 1868, Ulysses S. Grant is elected president, and he's reelected in 1872. You'll read a lot about Grant in the book, The Last Lincoln Republican. Ulysses S. Grant was president for 2 terms as a Republican, and for most of history, his presidency has been viewed as a failure, but historians have gone back and looked, and they're rehabilitating him. Historians are now arguing that, in fact, he was a much better president than he has been given credit for in the past, principally because for 8 years, Ulysses S. Grant protected the rights and privileges of blacks in the South. He kept the Army in the South, and during that time, black men were able to vote. In fact, some of them served in Congress. Federal troops effectively acted as a police force. Grant signed into law something known as the Force Act, which just crushed the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan was a white terrorist organization that had grown up after the Civil War. Grant sees that it's really almost dissolved and it doesn't come back until the early 20th century. There were some negative aspects of Grant's presidency. There was a lot of corruption, although he wasn't personally corrupt. There was an economic crash. But historians, again, are saying, well, those should take a backseat to his accomplishments and his fight, at least, for civil rights for African Americans in the South. Now, you are going to be reading in this book here, The Last Lincoln Republican. The book begins with a discussion of the 1876 election. And if you look at the slide, the 1876 election. Grant does not seek a 3rd term. There was nothing prohibiting him from doing it, but by tradition, since George Washington, those who had served 2 terms didn't seek a 3rd. So you have an election now that pits Rutherford B. Hayes from Ohio, who was the governor of Ohio, against Samuel Tilden, the governor of New York, a Democrat. Hayes had served in the Union Army. Tilden had not served in the military. And so the Republicans waved something, though, you read about this, the white flag, saying that all Democrats are traitors because it had been the Democrats who had rebelled against the Union. The problem for the Republicans was in 1876. Again, there had been an economic crash. There was a lot of corruption in the Grant administration, and Grant wasn't running, even though he was very popular. So they have a challenge winning this election. And on election night, it looks like the Democrat Samuel Tilden had won. Now, there's absolutely no doubt that Tilden won the popular vote, but as you know, popular vote doesn't mean anything. But Hayes himself went to bed that night thinking he had lost. It looked like the Democrats had won. However, there were several states, Oregon, Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana, where it was very, 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 very close. Between November, when the election occurred, and March, back then presidents were inaugurated in March, there was a furious battle to decide who wins. The Republicans have determined they're not going to lose. What eventually happens is a committee is set up in Washington, D.C. of 15 people. To determine who won these contested states. Tilden, strangely, doesn't come out publicly and really fight for it, although behind the scenes he was trying to determine the outcome of the election. Hayes stays almost entirely quiet. The 15-member commission eventually has 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats, and ultimately they award each one of these states to Hayes, and Hayes gets 185 electoral votes, Tilden 184. It's as close as you could possibly get. Hayes, therefore, is sworn in on March 4th, 1877, to be president. Now, he had already promised only to serve 1 term. But there is a deal made apart, ostensibly, kind of a quiet deal. Some historians question, but I'm telling you, there was a deal made. In return for Hayes being inaugurated, there's an agreement that every one of the troops that were still in the South protecting the freed slaves will be taken out. This is what the South wanted, the Democrats wanted. There will also be, the South will get economic benefits such as building of railroads and other things that will go to them. This is kind of a deal that is made that Hayes will serve 1 term, which he already is going to. The troops will be taken out of the South, and what this really means is that Reconstruction is over. This time period after the Civil War, in which you're trying to remake the South and white supremacy, guarantee equality for the freed slaves, the country turns its back on it. Reconstruction ends in 1877. For the country, this is a turning point. As you'll see, a lot of people in the United States simply want to move on from the Civil War. They're kind of tired of this constant fighting over what's going on in the South. For the free black population in the South, it means that their rights are going to be trampled on very soon. Historians mostly view Reconstruction as a failure. That the effort to remake the South and end white supremacy didn't work, and that the free black population was betrayed after the Civil War or after Reconstruction, and by the end of the century, most blacks in the South couldn't vote. They certainly weren't equal. And this is known as redemption in the South. When the South is redeemed, they're kind of reborn. They can get on with enacting white supremacy. The Southern troops are gone. And that concludes the lecture about Reconstruction. You will need to know all of this for a essay and other questions on the midterm.